So good afternoon. I'm Scott Standhart, Vice President of Client Services and Service Delivery here in our KORE Rochester facility. And today we're going to put together a virtual tour of the fulfillment center here in Rochester. We found over the years that really the best way to really convey our process rigor and methodology has been to get customers or business partners here. So we're going to try to replicate that today, but in this virtual environment. So first, let me give you a little background. So former Integron that KORE acquired in 2019, we'd been in business since 1985, and really early on focused on more traditional IT services. So we would help companies that were deploying and supporting essentially any kind of devices that were out in the field. So typically our corporate customers, they would have their own IT resources, but typically focused more on a campus setting. And anytime you had complexities involved with having 1,000, 10,000 field service techs or field sales reps across the country or across the globe, and managing the logistics in addition to the technical requirements, that's really where our niche was. And that was kind of our focus up until mid-2000s, and really for the last 12 to 13 years, it's really evolved more into the traditional IoT, cellular-enabled type of device environment. So that's where we have come from. In 2012, we attained our ISO 9001 and ISO 1345 certifications. I think most folks are familiar with 9001. It's kind of the industry standard, but 1345 is specific to the medical device space. So essentially from a device manufacturing and a packaging and relabeling, that was a focus that we put into place. And it's much like 9001 with the addition of the traceability and device history records on steroids. So a little bit higher requirements from a documentation perspective in that medical space. We're also an FDA registered facility. So again, handling manufacturing of finished good products and packaging and relabeling for medical devices. And that's really been one of our kind of strong selling points in the connected health space. Intent is to provide a virtual tour. We're going to start with an overview of our product realization process, which essentially is how we take a new customer opportunity through the implementation phase and into full production. And that really will provide the context for the process rigor that goes into getting a new customer onboarded and into production with the appropriate discipline necessary to ensure success. So we're going to go through that first, followed by a tour, and we'll actually see the various work functions in person. So starting in the mid-1990s, we started developing our own proprietary asset management system, which today is a HTML front end that's in use by the operators, talking to an SQL database backend. And really, again, proprietary from the standpoint of there wasn't anything in the marketplace that filled that niche of providing full end-to-end serial level tracking of a device lifecycle. And so from initial birth into the system, any configuration touch points to manage the various configurations that it can become, shipping activity, returns activity, all of those business logic steps were built into our asset management system. And as we go through the virtual tour, you'll see those touch points real time, just to understand what the value brings of that system. Okay. So in that phase two, as we're going through creating our production process, we're typically always looking at means in which we can apply automation tools to the process. In some cases, it may be scripting. Essentially, what we're trying to do is, create efficiencies from a production standpoint. How do we minimize labor touch time to increase our margins on the process? And obviously, the other eye is toward quality. So how do we ensure that, again, the first one, the 5,000th one, the 10,000th one all look the same? And typically, where we can kind of rule out human touch points, the better off we are. So that's a big part of phase two is how to create automation and efficiencies that allow us to scale the production process. All right, so as I mentioned before, we found historically really the best way to show and tell this whole process is really to see it firsthand. So we're now going to do a virtual tour of our production process and really following the life of a IoT device. So we will start out in the operations area. One of the keys when we set up a new SKU to be received systemically, we have a function called product categories, where essentially we determine what type of device it is and what attributes are required from a tracking perspective. So if you'd imagine, if we get in a router device that may have an integrated SIM, we need to track the ICC ID of the SIM, the router serial number. We may need to record MAC IDs for the device as well. The way we set up that SKU in the system will then dictate, the values that get entered into the asset management system to facilitate, the production and fulfillment later on, and provide all the reporting attributes that the customer requires. One of the other offshoots of the product category piece is any lock control requirements. So certainly, which we find more and more in the connected health space, where for various consumable items, we require tracking. It may not be serialized product, but understanding lot expiration dates, controls for FIFO, first in, first out type of fulfillment activity, and those are identified at the point of receipt. One piece that's common both from receiving function and as we go through the other fulfillment processes, you'll see a reconcile and post approach to everything, which kind of comes from an accounting background. So typically, as the technician and operator goes through the receiving process, they will, when they get to the point where they feel satisfied with the transaction, they'll perform a reconcile function that will print out a piece of paper identifying the summary of that transaction. And then a second operator will come through and validate that all the data on that particular record are accurate before it actually gets posted into the system. So it's kind of a two-step process. Reconcile it. At the point of reconciliation, if something is wrong, it can still go back and fix it. And once it's posted, that's actually what pushes the data live into the real-time system and is now visible to customers and internal personnel in the system. Okay, once the product gets received, we're now out in the warehouse. And so our current facility has approximately 20,000 square feet warehouse space. We're moving soon to a larger facility. But essentially the warehouse space consists of a few different types. We have this pick rack type of storage here, which you'll see usually primarily for some of the SIM fulfillment, kind of small items. We have these locked cages as well for a lot of product that's typically phones, tablets, handsets that have kind of value. We want to keep locked and segregated. Rack space that you'll see here for kind of mid-size product. And then we have bulk storage as well, so for pallet storage. As we touched on before, so again, we use a 3-schema warehouse functionality where we've segregated both physically and systemically for any customer their new inventory versus unknown inventory versus failed inventory. And you'll see there's alphanumeric codes for all the rack space. Essentially, when a technician gets an order to go fulfill, each SKU will tell them what location in the warehouse to pull the product from. So when they come out here, again, there may be bigger warehouses in the world, but this is still pretty good size. And so for the technician to be able to identify where exactly to pull the product from, the order will tell them that via the alphanumeric location codes. Pause.
We don't really do that.
We had it in the high bond.
There are temperature sensors here. 3 temperature sensors, 2 in the high volume.
But we've measured it.
What we measure.
So what do you think? Is that a plus?
Alright, and go.
All right. Now you may come across opportunities, and we've seen it largely in the healthcare space, but where customers require some sort of conditioned storage, either from a temperature control perspective or humidity perspective. And we do currently have some capability to handle that. Today we monitor humidity, don't necessarily control it. And we do have some air conditioned space that we can have. Tends to be smaller footprint than certainly the bulk of the warehouse. So that's something that we also intend to grow. We'll be moving facilities later this year. In addition to essentially doubling our warehouse space, we're also growing out that footprint to provide conditioned storage space as well. So that we have today to a smaller degree, but we're going to build that out further in the next generation.
Go.
Good. All right. Now we're we're going to talk a little bit about our production process. We're out here in our high volume center where we're producing cellular enabled USB adapters for a cardiac implant support type project. And you'll see, I think one of the common threads as part of that, we talked a little bit about the product realization. As we get into developing the production process, one of the outputs of that will be what we call a workbook. Basically, this is a step-by-step instructions for essentially how to build a particular finished good for that customer. And so the workbook becomes essentially the baseline configuration process. And so the team out here will use that to build the devices. We've got, I don't know if you can see, there's some test beds. And this is a case where we've got a high degree of scripting and automation. So essentially, once we assemble the USB adapter with a SIM, it's a process where basically one technician can man 4 test stations, plug 4 devices in, click a button, and all of the kind of test requirements happen behind the scenes. So it'll ping the tower, validate connectivity test. It will tell the asset management system that SIM and that USB adapter are now joined together. It'll update the configuration to represent that those 2 devices are now together at the appropriate configuration for that customer's finished good. Basically, all that happens behind the scenes, not tech dependent. So they just click a button and it does the rest. It's like the old Kodak saying, "We press the button, we do the rest." That's what's happening out here in this production process. So at the end, we'll have the appropriate finished good built up, ready to put on the shelf, pending an order from the customer for shipment. Okay. So a little more deep dive on the automation that's happening behind the scenes. So essentially, when we connect the adapter and the SIM to the tool device, it pulls the SIM and the adapter, essentially reads from the firmware what the IMEI is of the USB adapter, what the ICC ID is of the SIM. Essentially does some validations that those do exist in an appropriate customer's warehouse, that they are the appropriate SKUs to create the finished good that the technician is attempting to create. It will do a ping test to essentially validate that the connection is happening, automatically sets the APN for the device. At the end, it will actually do from an asset management perspective, the build of the finished good, which does the debiting of the child components and essentially adds the finished good back into inventory. And at the end, it prints out the labels required to go onto the finished good box from a fulfillment perspective, and that's a validation that those steps were performed correctly. Again, all of this happens behind the scenes. The operator doesn't need to know, these 12 steps have been performed, but the output of the labels and the confirmation that this is all transpired allows us to continue on, and certainly from a quality perspective. And it does create a date and time stamped log file of that activity. So from a device history record perspective, we have essentially this virtual record that those steps happened successfully, and we have that QA in place to support it. All right.
And go.
Okay, so now we're out in one of our primary production areas. This is kind of different from the high volume area, where high volume tends to be, high volume but low touch from a device configuration perspective. This is a bit of the opposite, where it's lower volume, hundreds versus thousands, but high touch from a configuration requirement. What you'll see, again, very consistent, we'll have a workbook, which is the specific work instructions. Again, this is always customer and platform dependent. And in this case, it ties in, instead of having virtual scripting behind the scenes, we'll have actual, what we call in-process checklists. So the in-process checklist essentially takes the major work steps involved in the workbook and summarizes those, and essentially it's printed per serial number, but it basically guides the technician, and as they perform each major step in the process, they'll sign off and initialize that they've performed those steps. So essentially from a QA perspective, this provides us with both the QA as well as the device history record of the steps performed on a particular configuration. Okay, we're up in another operations center in the building that's currently handling returns processing of returned multi-tech devices for another customer involved with home kidney dialysis machines. So we just talked about outbound fulfillment, and essentially once devices are deployed, we typically will support customers with various aspects of reverse logistics. So in many cases, they may contract for us to provide advanced exchange orders. So if a device goes down the field, we'll ship out a replacement device. We'll include the return packaging and return label for them to return the defective device back to us. And essentially that, from a receiving standpoint, as we talked about in the receiving module, it gets returned into an unknown status pending testing and diagnosis. The team out here will grab those return devices. It'll go through whatever the test protocol is for that particular class of device. And there's we call it WIP record, but essentially any return generates a record that says, basically, I'm unknown until you tell me if I'm good or bad. And so we'll go through the test protocol, identify if it's pass or fail. If it's a failed device, we'll tell the system, essentially what was the malfunction. Was it no power, won't connect, cosmetic damage, whatever the case may be. A lot of that's critical to our customers understand, the condition of the platform and the kind of things we're experiencing. For past devices, essentially get cleaned, they'll put back into good inventory. We handle all of the repackaging back to whatever the OEM spec is or whatever the customer requirement is, and essentially put them back into redeployable status. For failed devices, if it's under warranty still, we'll coordinate with the manufacturer and provide essentially the warranty handling to get it exchanged or replaced by the manufacturer. All of that being transparent to the end customer. Without a warranty, typically we'll, as part of our onboarding or initial project kind of planning phases, we'll set some criteria as to, if there's a ceiling in terms of economic viability, any repair over $200, just scrap the device. So typically we'll work with the customer to understand what are those thresholds for handling a failed product if it's out of warranty. But essentially, like I said, that's kind of handle all behind the scenes for a customer, but we give them all the data to support what's going on with their platforms. Very specific to the medical space, which again has been really a growth area of ours for the last number of years. Any type of medical device being returned to us has to go through a decontamination process. So depending on the type of material, there's some standards for essentially how to clean it. Obviously we want to protect our own employees as well as provide a product that could be redeployable in the correct condition. Any porous materials get discarded. Essentially if we can't decontaminate it, then it gets scrapped. So blood pressure cuffs, documentation, things like that essentially fall into that category and get scrapped. Everything else will go through the appropriate decontamination process. And that's something that's part of that whole device history record and tracking of all the activities that are done on a particular device. All right, so essentially a byproduct of all the things that we've seen, both from a receiving functionality, the configuration management, configuration of devices, the shipping, returns handling. All of these things provide a ton of reporting capabilities to our end customers. So in many cases, they'll receive daily shipment reports, receiving reports. We've got device history reports, so by serial number that show the complete life cycle. Every time there's been a touch point, whether it's received, shipped, configuration changed, all that's captured in the asset management system and is capable of being reported back to our customers. In many cases, we do quarterly business reviews. We're pulling data on performance. As we look at returns handling, the pass fail rates, what are the malfunctions? Are there cases where we need to go back to a manufacturer and look at potential design changes, things like that. Over the years, all that data we've used in a bunch of different ways to essentially improve the business case for our customers and give them the data they need to perform analytics on their fleet. I'm hopeful that seeing this all firsthand and seeing the work process in real time has given you a flavor for our quality process, the type of process rigor we have to ensure success in the customer engagements, and if you have any. So hopefully seeing all of this firsthand, the process rigor, the flow, the asset management system that supports this, puts you in a position to more deeply engage with your customer from a solution development perspective. The cross-selling is certainly a strategic direction for the company, and I think having this understanding will help you kind of better position KORE for future sales. So thank you, and good luck selling.